All right. Before we get started talking about those vulnerabilities, we'd like to take a step back and talk about why we need this webinar. Our goal is to keep you aware of the risk involved in running a digital service in 2020. TrueFire, it was beginning of this year, it was 5 months worth of credit card data that was stolen. And then we move on to Wawa, that was later in January, 30 million payment card stolen. We move through to Virgin Media, it was 900,000 UK-based customers. Information that was compromised. Marriott International also had personal information of 5.2 million hotel guests. As we go through, you can see in spring, early spring, we had EasyJet, email and travel details of 9 million customers compromised. And finally, we have the Blue Leaks, which was the US police and FBI information. Was a leak of 269 gigabytes. As you can see here, Equifax had to pay almost 600 million in fines and also lost their customer trust as a result of the 2017 data breach. Capital One and British Airways were also fined in millions of dollars as a result of their 2019 and 2018 data breaches. So we can't stress enough that it is very important to address your cybersecurity risk when your company stores or processes personal and/or sensitive information. All right, so what are vulnerabilities? Vulnerabilities are system weaknesses that represent business risk to your organization. An unpatched vulnerability may lead to a data breach. In the case of Equifax, it was a publicly reported but unpatched Apache Strut vulnerability that led to that system compromise. Vulnerabilities may relate to a software product that your organization uses, but does not necessarily maintain. Recently, while conducting a penetration test for one of our clients, White Hat Labs discovered a vulnerability in a well-known accounting vendor software, and it would have had a negative impact on their business as a whole. And please keep an eye out. We'll be publishing those findings later this month. Okay, so the agenda for this webinar that Pasha is going to cover is going to be 5 recent vulnerabilities that are relevant in 2020. We're going to start with HTTP request smuggling, serverless vulnerabilities, remote code execution in Apache Spark, remote code execution in CMS or content management system, and hidden property attack in NodeJS ecosystem.
HTTP request smuggling has been around since 2005. But there are new variations of exploits that exploit the same vulnerability that are coming out. For example, in 2019, a security researcher was able to successfully exploit HTTP request smuggling on PayPal.com. He reported it to PayPal, and PayPal patched it immediately. However, to demonstrate that he could exploit it, he could successfully get another user's credentials on PayPal.com website. And the only condition is that that neighboring user had to use the PayPal.com at the same time as he did.
So does this mean that in that example, that if I were a neighboring user, an attacker could access my data? And what exactly would be compromised?
It would be possible to get your PayPal credentials, access your PayPal account, and initiate financial transactions and get your account activity. So anything within the scope of what PayPal account allows you to do. There are a few conditions that are needed for this vulnerability to be exploitable. Number one, the website infrastructure should contain a front end and a back end, and usually it's a proxy and a web server. Number two, the proxy and the web server should understand the content length of the request differently based on 2 headers, content length and content type. The opportunity for this vulnerability arises out of different web services and proxies not adhering to the same RFC standards. So when the front end thinks that the request is a little bit longer and the backend thinks that the request is a little bit shorter, it's an opportunity for an attacker to smuggle some text into the neighboring user request. As you can see on the image here to the bottom right, that orange piece of text is being smuggled into the request of the neighboring user. In the same way, an attacker can get some text out of the neighboring user request, and that's how he can get credentials to paypal.com. Serverless technology is generally more secure because it limits the scope of what an attacker can do once he's able to successfully execute his code in your application. While doing a penetration test for a client of ours, we have discovered, it was for a serverless application, we have discovered that authorization was missing. We were able to register a customer account on our client's platform and start accessing resources of other users. It was a confidentiality impact to their business, and this vulnerability could be classified under broken access control. As you see, S5 on the list to the right. There are other types of vulnerabilities serverless applications are vulnerable to, like injection. If you are using AWS for your serverless app, you might be using AWS Lambda functions. But the code of this Lambda function still need to be checked, because if they're written improperly, for example, if they contain eval statements, an attacker could smuggle some JavaScript code in his request, and that code could be executed by that eval statement. Now, to continue in the exploit chain, if your serverless application also has security misconfiguration and your Lambda function role has access to a S3 bucket, and for example, this S3 bucket stores configuration for your Kubernetes cluster that also stores the base64 encoded credentials to that Kubernetes cluster. An attacker, by using those two exploits, injection and security misconfiguration, he could first execute his code using your Lambda function and then have your Lambda function access that S3 bucket using AWS API and extract those credentials. So as you see, vulnerability by itself may not represent a big risk, but a combination of them can lead to serious consequences. Moving on to the next type of vulnerability. And that type can be only executed in traditional environments, not serverless. Remote code execution in Apache Spark. Remote code execution in general is what results in a data breach. It's when an attacker can execute his code on your server. He can then use that to overtake your server, escalate privileges, and even move laterally in the network. That's exactly what happened with Equifax. They initially compromised their unimportant customer service portal through an Apache Spark, through an Apache Struts vulnerability. And then they were able to move laterally onto a core application that contained all the social security numbers. So it's very important to be aware of any RCE or remote code execution vulnerabilities that are coming up and track them and patch them in time. In Equifax case, they weren't able to patch the vulnerability in time after it's been public for some time. And that's what caused the data breach. So moving on to Apache Spark, it's a little bit different than Apache Struts. Apache Spark 2.4.5 or older allows an attacker to bypass authentication by sending a specifically crafted remote procedure call. And eventually, once he bypasses authentication, he can launch application resources into the cluster and he can execute code on the host. That again leads to other consequences that I mentioned before. Moving on to the next type of vulnerability, it's a code execution in content management systems. And one big difference from the previous one we talked about is that this vulnerability has a condition. An attacker should be in control of your CMS templates. Without control of your CMS templates, he won't be able to exploit this vulnerability at all. So it puts lesser risk on this one compared to the previous one. And most of the Java-based and .NET-based content management systems are affected. Here you can see a couple of examples on the right. In an image to the center, you can see an example of remote code execution through the template. This piece of ASP code that is actually executable in a template will launch a calculator app on a Windows server that hosts this content management system, SharePoint. In this example, it's a SharePoint. So if an attacker can smuggle his code into your template, he can get different applications started on your computer, on a Windows computer host. On an example to the top, you can see an attacker could output the contents of web.config file. And that config file contains multiple keys, like a verification key. If he gets his hands on the verification key, he can then move on into a remote code execution exploit.
Interesting. Could this allow one of our customers' databases to be compromised?
Yeah, so once an attacker got control of the host and able to execute his code on the host, there is a very high chance he could get his hands on the data. Depending on what the application does, he could also do what the application does, for example. So if your application processes health information, and an attacker could change the health records of patients, that could affect the life of those patients because doctors would read that information differently and make different decisions of how to treat the patient. If your application processes financial transactions, then an attacker would have the same scope of control, which he could send funds to a different destination.
Right, and would this give them access to one of our customer servers?
Yeah, that's what remote code execution is practically is. It's gaining, executing his code or getting access to the server. That type of attack can allow attackers to manipulate your application logic, get confidential data, bypass security checks, and even launch denial of service attacks. And it relates to how NodeJS processes your requests. When Node.js processes any input from the outside as part of the request, it converts it into a JavaScript object with properties. So it allows an attacker to an ability to form that JavaScript object. And if application uses this object, doesn't destroy it immediately, but continues using it along the application logic, it's possible for an attacker to change how the application functions. It also applies to prototype properties that are in __proto property of the JavaScript object. So if I'm sending JSON and I have __proto as part of the parameters, it will be converted to a JavaScript property, prototype object. So an attacker has a pretty huge leverage on object, on the structure of this object. And again, if your application relies on this object, it will be, its logic could be changed and an attacker could either bypass security checks or get some confidential data out of it. To prevent this, it's important to review your Node.js code to make sure your application doesn't rely on those properties.